Good morning, and welcome to the SJSU Plan Giving Virtual Seminar Series. I want to thank our presenter today, Rod Zeeb, CEO and co-founder of Generative Group, LLC, and the Heritage Design. Thank you for sharing your time and knowledge with us today. My name is Nick Messing, and I'm the Alumni Engagement Specialist at San Jose State. And I've been a member of the SJSU Advancement Team since 2016. This is the first seminar of a 3-session webinar series on multiple generational planning, and it is brought to you by our Office of Legacy Planning in partnership with the SJSU Alumni Association and special events. We will start off with brief etiquette items, followed by the presentation, and we'll conclude with a Q&A session. At the end and throughout Rod's session, you will have a chance to ask questions. Please submit questions using the Q&A button or entering them in the chat on your toolbar at any time during the presentation. There may not be time to answer every question during the Q&A, but we will download the chat and follow up with any unanswered questions in the next few days. Randy Baylog, Director of Planned Giving, and Annie Clark, Planned Giving Coordinator, will monitor the chat and Q&A sections. Depending on time, questions will be answered throughout the webinar. We ask you to keep comments appropriate or we will remove you from the webinar. Please be aware that we're recording today's event and it will be available to view on our website in the near future. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Rod Zeeb. Rod is passionate about helping families prepare their children and grandchildren for the inheritances they will receive and to thrive together as a family for multiple generations. He is a self-proclaimed recovering estate planning attorney with a casual and easygoing persona. While he greatly enjoys and takes pride in founding the Heritage Institute, his true passion is working one-on-one with families. He's known for guiding them to a place of increased confidence, preparing their heirs, and having more fun. In the early 1990s, Rod began studying why only a few families continue to thrive and grow from generation to generation, while most families imploded by the end of the 3rd generation. This phenomenon later became known as the 90% rule, as numerous studies, books, and articles concluded that approximately 90% of families failed to keep their family and family wealth together for 3 or more generations. Rod studied what the 10% of families who thrive for multiple generations did. As a result of the study, Rod co-developed the Heritage process and later founded the Heritage Institute to train other estate planning attorneys, financial advisors, philanthropic advisors, and other professionals to help their clients beat the 90% rule. This and ongoing seminars support SJSU's mission as a center of knowledge, including estate planning and financial literacy. Without further ado, I turn it to you, Rod.
All right, thank you. Oh, they're spotlighting my video. Okay, so as I said, we're going to start today with the 3 components of effective multi-generational planning, and we'll talk through that. But there is a series. There's a reason why there's a series. So, and I think the next picture is just me, and we don't really need that one. So then next slide. So here's the 3 series. This one will give you the overview of how this works. Then the second one in June is the power of your story and life lessons. And some people, when they hear that, it's like, oh, that's the soft side. Nothing soft about this. What you'll find is one of the things we'll talk about are there are studies that show that children and grandchildren who know where they came from, know their family story and life lessons, are measurably more resilient than those who don't. So that's a big one. Then in September, we'll talk about philanthropy as a training tool and transformational philanthropy. And it's a phenomenal tool that you can use to train a bunch of different things, but also to pass who you are to the next generations. So that's kind of what the series is going to be. So now, as we get started here, many parents and grandparents desire to prepare their heirs for the inheritances and keep their family together. When we ask, like when I was the estate planning attorney, I was asking questions, what do you want? A lot of times you got the negatives. I don't want them to be trust fund babies. I don't want them to blow it all and all that. That's the preparing their heir part. But they also generally wanted them to stay together for multiple generations. The problem is, next slide. The problem is it doesn't happen. I mean, history, our own study, other studies, and our experiences show that traditional planning has failed miserably to keep families and the fortunes together for 3 or more generations. And we'll walk through some of these studies and things as we go, and at least some of the quotes that we got from around the world. Next slide. So here's the rules. Okay, so this came from a study that Roy Williams and the Williams Group did. And what they found that there's about a 70% failure rate at each generation. So 70% of the time, the money is gone by the end of the 2nd generation. And then next slide, 90% of the time it's gone by the end of the third. That's why this label of the 90% rule came about. And this has been going on for a long time. Okay, so next slide. Most families I know, they want to beat the 90% rule. Most of them don't think they can. I mean, it's like, but they can. But most families want to beat the 90%. They want to keep their family together and the money together. They don't want them to see the money all blow away. And so then the question is, do you? I mean, do you care? Not everybody does. Some people care and some people don't. There's one US trust study that showed about 24% of people just don't care. But most families do. This is the question that I ask my clients when I first start. Are you confident that your children and grandchildren are prepared to manage, protect, and grow their inheritances? Because if you are, cool. I mean, then we'll, but the answer is overwhelmingly no. So then the next question is, so would you like to? I mean, would you like to prepare them so they're ready? And if so, then, what does that mean to prepare them? See, we got a poll coming up here. So, the question of the poll here is, have you prepared yourself to make family decisions, or your family to make decisions together? There we go. All right. Cool. All right. This group is actually probably more prepared than most of them that I see. So that's interesting. All right. So, and most people know someone that have done this, that have failed to keep the money and wealth together, and usually in a spectacular form. So, that's the next question. How many do you know? None, or a couple, or a lot? And we'll get that poll in here too. Wow, interesting. Okay. All right. So, whoa, we're getting them all here. And we'll see that this communication, there's a reason why we have this communication question in here. Mostly great. Okay, cool. Yeah, the communication thing is a big thing, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So, and then the next question obviously is, what would it mean to you to have confidence? It's one thing to have confidence. What does it mean to you, and what does it mean to your family? All right, so as we do that, what we see here is that history shows this 90% rule has been going on for centuries all over the world. And where this came from, I mean, I'll tell you my story. Okay, so as they said earlier, I'm a recovering estate planning attorney. I was an estate planning attorney back in the day. I'll show my age, back in the 80s. And I had a case where they did, I didn't do the planning, I helped with it, but somebody did phenomenal estate planning. It was a client of mine from my family's real estate days before this. And this guy was a huge real estate developer in a very major city that was growing like crazy. And he had two sons. And when he died, this estate was a huge estate. He had told me his estate was around $100 million. When I talked to the accountant, he said, well, yeah, that's all the real estate that he paid for, like in the early 60s. So in the 80s, it was a big estate. And what happened was he had two sons. The oldest son ran 3 businesses bankrupt within a decade and blew his entire share, all of it. In fact, he borrowed money from his little brother. his little brother was a friend of mine, and he drank himself to death in about 7 years. And it was all because he was overwhelmed. He couldn't, he felt guilty about getting money he hadn't earned. He couldn't compete with dad. He didn't know what he was supposed to do. It just totally consumed him. And so when I looked at that, after he died, I remember sitting at my desk going, okay, that's not an acceptable outcome. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life getting as much money as I can to the next generation, only to kill the next generation. So I started doing the research to find out if I did something wrong. And what was interesting is one of the first quotes we found was from China from 2,000 years ago. So if you go to the next slide. And it said, this 2,000 years ago, wealth never survives 3 generations. And when I saw that, I went, wait a minute. I thought this was an American issue or a tax issue or something. No, it's, this has been going on forever. So we got China from 2,000 years ago. And then we started searching all around and we found quotes from most major countries. We just have a few of them on here. So the next one that we found in terms of ages was England with the clogs in 3 generations. You may have heard that. And then we get to, excuse me, next slide. Then we get to Spain. This is one of my favorites. 1st generation trader, 2nd generation gentleman, 3rd generation beggar. That kind of says it all, doesn't it? Right? And I happen to be of German descent. So the next one kind of makes sense to me. We're a little more formal about this. Seldom 3 descents continue good. Then we had rags to riches to rags in 3 generations, and then shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. So we've got ours. And then more recently in Brazil, they have from the stables to the stars to the stables in 3 generations, which again, I think that kind of says it all. So when I looked at all this, I went, wait a minute, the things that I thought were important aren't important, right? Geography, cultures, governments, doesn't matter if it's communist or capitalist or whatever, tax structures, none of that mattered. This is a human issue, and it's been going on for a couple thousand years. And that's where this all started going. So next slide. So when I looked at it, I said, okay, so why is this? And as you look through it, it wasn't due to lack of traditional financial and estate planning. They had good CPAs or financial advisors and estate planning attorneys. It wasn't due to that. It was due to the fact that they were, next slide, they were passing the money, were focused on the money rather than wealth. And they weren't focused on the client's desired outcome, the people that they were doing its desired outcome. So when you think about money and wealth, it's kind of a weird thing now because wealth now is defined by money. A lot of the times it's kind of been hijacked by money. But if you go back and look before the Industrial Revolution, the definition of wealth didn't have anything to do with money. It was all about health and well-being. And, that's what, so we've been focused on the money and the taxes and all that kind of stuff, and not what the client's desired outcomes are. So we'll talk about how that goes. Now, from that, we started looking at, okay, what do we think and what's really happening? So we'll go through several of these. The first one was a study that was done by Family Office Exchange back in 2009. So after the big crash, this, I think they put it out in, February of 2009. And they asked their members, which is about 350 members, what do you think is going to get you? And if you add up those top 3, which are all about money, that's like 78, 79%. And you notice that the family stuff in there, that's down to what, 7%. And then there's kind of everything else. So that's what and when I've done this kind of informally with clients and things, that's pretty much what we think. It's going to be the money. They're going to blow it all. They're going to buy stupid things, end up on drugs or they'll get taxed to death or whatever. But that's what most people think. But then the Williams Group did this study, and they studied 3,100, I think it was, families who had wealth a generation ago and lost it. And so next slide. Their question was, what got you? And look at that. 60% of the time it was lack of communication and trust. 25% of the time it was unprepared errors. 10% of the time it's no common purpose, no family mission. All that money stuff that we thought was going to get us is part of that 5% everything else. So this is what really gets families. This is why that 90% rule applies. And ultimately, when we got done with the study, what we found was the successful families who had been together for 3 or more generations, they create a culture of communication, trust, and mentoring that was all wrapped around their family purpose. And what's interesting, we came up with that in about 98. Williams did this study and they published it in 2003. So when I first met Roy, I thanked him for doing the study and coming up with all the empirical data that supported what we had said back in 98, 99. But it's still true. I mean, what keeps families together is creating that culture of communication, trust, and mentoring, all wrapped around the family purpose. So now, next slide. The other huge gap, or another huge gap that exists, is what we know about wealth transfer and what's actually done. So what we know about wealth transfer, most of this, next slide, is really done in the last 20 years. And there's a bunch of new ones since the pandemic. I mean, there are several new studies and things that came out in the last couple of years. But these are all the studies that are out there, and they all talk about this communication and family governance and all that sort of thing. But what's actually done, the other thing that we know is for baby boomers and their parents, when they were asked what's the most important inheritance you can give or receive, it was 86% for baby boomers and 77% for the parents was the family story and life lesson. That's, every time I look at that picture, it freaks me out because those kids, those are my two oldest grandkids. The girl is 16 now and driving, and the boy is taller than I am. He's 14. Anyway, so for the baby boomers, it was 10 times more important to pass or receive the story and life lessons than it was the assets, the financials or real estate. And when that study first came out, people said, okay, that's great, but that's the people who are passing it. No, that's the boomers were both. Remember, they studied the boomers and the elders, their parents. So they were both generations. But then in 2019, next slide, Wells Fargo interviewed, I think it was 1,000 students or 1,000 kids between the ages of 16 and 26, and said, what's the most important thing that you can receive from your parents? And 90% of them said it was the parents' values, and in the story and things. So this isn't just theory from coming from afar. These are what real people are saying, including the kids who are inheriting all this stuff. So when you look at that, what we find is quality financial and estate planning does a great job of building, protecting, and passing the financial inheritance. So it's really good with the money. But next slide, it does a horrible job of passing the non-financial assets, which is also the things that you'll hear. It's called the emotional inheritance. There's all sorts of different names for it, but it's the things that, the other things that make you, your story, your life lessons, your value, standards, and principles, all that sort of thing. So how do we beat the 90% rule? That's really the big question. How do we beat the 90% rule? And like I said, what I did is I studied the 10%. So we went to, next slide, we went to, what do the 10% do differently? And we studied families from all over the world that have been around for a long time. And what they do differently is they have a third component to their planning. They do the financial and the estate planning, but then they have this third component where they pass the non-financial stuff and they build a foundation that supports it. So they build that culture within the family and a mentoring style where they pass from one generation to the other. We call it monarch to mentor, where the parents go from being the monarch who tells everybody what to do to being the mentor who helps that next generation learn and grow. So that's really the difference. And again, that's the bottom line is we actually found 12 different attributes, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But building that culture of communication, trust, and mentoring wrapped around the family purpose is what does it. And if you don't have the mentoring, it's not going to work because you've got to be able to go from generation to generation to generation. All right. So what I did when my friend died is I started just asking as an estate planning attorney, so what's the most important thing in your life? And this is a list of the kind of things that I would get. And you notice money's on the list, but it was almost never first. Money was, okay, that's the tool that will get us all these other things that we want. So money's on the list, but it's not the top priority. There's all this stuff that's on the list. And when you look at wealth, there's different kinds of wealth. Now, years ago, about the same time we wrote Beating the Money Curse, Jay Hughes wrote a book called Family Wealth, Keeping It in the Family. And he came up with the quadrants. Okay. So there's human capital, intellectual capital, financial capital, social capital. Financial is what we think of, right? It's money and all that stuff. Intellectual capital is what we've learned, informal and formal education. Human capital is who we are. What are we good at? And things like that. And then social capital is how we interact with the world and the community. More recently, Dennis Jaffe and some others did a study, what they call a generative family study. And again, they studied, I don't know how many they're up to now, but it was over 100 families the last time I talked to them. And that were into at least the third generation. And the family was still successful. And it was still consistent with the values that they started with. And what they found was there was this fifth component, the family legacy component, that was dead center in the middle. And when they found that, they said, that's the piece that keeps everybody together. We have all these other things, and they have some other a little bit different definitions for what it was. But that's the piece. So when it came out, I called Dennis and I said, okay, so what does family legacy mean to you? I mean, and what he said was, and I wrote it down here so I'd read it. He said, legacy capital is the mission, values, purpose, core purpose, and shared meaning that are the foundation of the family and its approach to its wealth and relationship to its others, to everybody else. So that family legacy is that non-financial piece. It's who you are and what's important to you and what the stories are. That's the piece that binds all these other things together, according to the most recent study. So these are the 12 elements. We wrote a paper, my son and I did, called The Elements of Heritage Design, Sustaining Family Wealth and Unity Across Generations. And later on, we'll show you how you can get that. But these were the first 11, okay? So they do build communication and trust. They have shared vision. They meet regularly. If you think about families you know or know of who have been together for multiple generations, they probably get together every year or so to work on the family, the business of being a family, not the family business. The balanced view of wealth means that they're looking, it's not all about the money, it's about the people and the philanthropy and the things that they're doing. If they have a family business, they keep the family business and the family separate from each other. So you don't have one meeting and do it all. We did a meeting one time and a friend of mine did a session on the non-economic issues of dealing with the family business. And he started by standing up and putting his arms on the lectern and just standing there. And it got really quiet. And he goes, I fired my daughter today. Then her father fired her. Then his wife fired him. Going to be kind of quiet at Thanksgiving this year. And that's really true. I mean, if you have a family business, it can, just subsume everything. They know the roles that's necessary for the family to be successful. And then number 7, they inspire people and train them and mentor them so that they can do it. So that 6, 7, and 8 all kind of go together. And then they facilitate the genuine transfer of leadership. They don't just, the parents don't just hold on to everything until they die and then hope the next generation can make decisions. They give them what we call pre-inheritance experiences. They give them a little bit to make decisions on and learn from both their mistakes and their successes. Ongoing family governance, that's a term that gets some people really kind of freaked out. All family governance means is you have a way of making decisions together and how you're going to resolve upsets together. It can get really complex. I have one family that they brought out like 5 notebooks. That was their family governance. Nobody knew what it meant. Others, it's like a page. So, there's all sorts of ways of doing it, but all that means is there's a defined way of making decisions and resolving upsets that everybody's agreed to. And then one thing that's really interesting is we found that these families, generally speaking, they require true collaboration amongst their professional advisors. They had their advisors talking to each other. And one of the reasons that's important is because if you're going to an attorney and then you go to an accountant and then you go to a financial advisor, you may be telling them 3 different stories because they're asking you 3 different sets of questions and you're answering the questions. And so you may get different advice from your accountant than you do from your financial guys than you do from the attorney. When they have true collaboration and everybody's sharing the same information, then they get narrowed in. And then the last thing is, next slide, you do it now. You do it. You don't wait till everything in there. You invite everybody, but you work with the willing. You can't let anybody be the one that vetoes it, and says, I can't come or whatever. What I found over the years is that happens a lot. There'll be somebody that's like, I'm not going to come or I can't come. And the parents don't want to upset them. And that just gives them power. The minute you say, okay, we're going ahead without you, and then you do, then it's amazing how many of them come back the next year and make it happen. So those are the 12 elements. And like I said, there's a paper you can get for that and we'll send it to you. Okay, so the next big question is, what's it take to get the next generations to do this? I mean, to get involved in this. And there's 2 questions that they ask themselves, and they ask them in this order. Is it worth it, or can I do it? And can I do it? And the reason I say they ask in that order normally is because if it isn't worth it, it doesn't matter if they can do it or not, they're not going to do it. And if it's really worth it, right? If it just nails it, they're going to figure out a way to do it. So a lot of this is is framing things in ways that it's worth it to them, not standing, talking to them and telling them and planning at them. One of my friends talks about, are you planning at your children or planning with your children? Planning at it doesn't work very well. Planning with it is where they start realizing it's worth it to me to be involved in this and to really understand what's going on. One of the answers I get to this when we first start talking about it is people go, I've done my planning. I've done my financial planning, I've done my estate planning, I've done my planning. And it was interesting. One of my clients was introducing me to one of his friends. And that's exactly what his friend said. He goes, why do I want to do this? I've done my planning. Next slide. And what the client said was, this is better description than I could ever do. He said, yeah, our financial and estate planning, it passes what we own, right? It passes what you own to future generations. Next slide. But this is what's going to pass who you are to the next generation, and then build that culture that they need to stay together for multiple generations. And that's really what we talk about, the third component. You need good financial and estate planning, but you also need them to prepare the next generation. Okay, next slide. So this is a great quote. Transformation doesn't come from doing things bigger, better, faster, or more of it. Transformation comes from starting from a different place. And that's what we're talking about here. Not everybody, most people have their will and their trust and their, financial planning and stuff, but there's an awful lot of people who don't go that next step and prepare their kids for what they're going to get. And, I have to admit, as a lawyer, I didn't do that. And partly because in Oregon, there was a debate about whether it was a conflict of interest to represent both the kids and the parents in case they sue each other. So that created a little bit of an issue for me. So what heritage design is designed to do is it's that essential third component to help multi-generational planning. And the way I explain it to my clients, because, is next slide. I started talking about this with one of my clients, and he goes, "What? Forgot it the first time when you did your planning? I mean, I thought we did comprehensive planning." And actually, his comment to me was, "You have another kid going to college and you need to make more money." So I had to explain it to him and say, "No, okay, you have financial planning, which grows and protects and all that, your assets while you're alive." And this particular guy's, I said, that was with Jordan. That was his financial planning. He's doing a great job. And then there's estate planning, which is what we did. We did a phenomenal job. You got a great estate plan to pass it now to the next generation. But what we haven't done is heritage design, which is to prepare the kids for what they're going to get. And that's my friend's story who drank himself to death. They didn't have that part of it. My analogy to him, because he was a football player, was it doesn't matter if the quarterback throws a perfect spiral. That's not a great pass if it's caught by the other team or it's dropped. It's, unless it's only a good pass if your guy catches it. That's what we're talking about here, is preparing that next generation, both for what they're going to receive and to work together so that they'll stay together for multiple generations. Next slide. One of the questions that I changed in my estate planning, originally my estate planning was kind of the classic, how much money do you want to leave to your kids and when do you want them to get it? But the shift in this is, what impact do you want the wealth to have on your children and grandchildren? And again, it's interesting, when I asked that question, the first answers I got were mostly negative. I don't want them to be trust fund babies. I don't want, I don't. So we had to get around to, what do you want? But that's really where heritage design comes in. It's for you to think about what impact you want the financial wealth that you're leaving to your children and grandchildren to have, both on them and on the world and on the things that are important to you. It's your wealth in general, and your children and grandchildren and beyond. And then what impact do you want your philanthropy to have on your children and grandchildren? A lot of people don't think about this, and they have their philanthropy and there's a reason why they do it, but their kids and grandkids have no idea why they're involved with whatever the philanthropy is that they're involved with. And one of my clients, very, very active in philanthropy, several different charities that he was either on the board or chairman of the board for and stuff. And as we got into this and we started going to this point, his kids were asking, okay, we know who you give to, but we don't know why. And what's important about that to you. So we want to know why it's important to you and whether it should be important to us. And the other thing they wanted to know, which I thought was fascinating, is we don't want just a list of the things that you're giving to. We want to know who you said no to and why. What was it that you looked at so you knew the philanthropy was going to get the result that you wanted? So those are the two questions that come into the heritage design forum. is what do you want it to do for your kids, and what do you want it to do with your philanthropy to do? And like I said, these are the things you see all the time. And a lot of them, I think my kids are okay, but I'm not sure about my grandkids. I want them to be happy together. I want them to be good stewards if they're going to be that. And I want to pass both my wealth and my faith. I hear that a lot. What's interesting is faith is probably one of the number one things that we see want to be passed. Faith in what is all over the board. When I say that, a lot of people think we're talking about Judeo-Christian or something. That's not at all. It's whatever their faith is in that they really drive, that really drives them. And they want to teach their children and grandchildren about the wealth. And sometimes it's how they got it. Sometimes it's what it's going to mean. So if any of those things come up and they resonate, that's where this whole process of heritage design comes from. And next slide. So that's the picture. We're not going to go very deep into it because we don't have time and this isn't the forum for it. But the alignment conversation you see there, that's really a conversation where what you're going to get asked are things like, what's most important to you? And what are your desired outcomes for your children, your family in the future? And not just what is it? These aren't hopes and wishes. We said desired outcomes. Outcomes are final results and they can be measured. So what are those things you want to see in or hear or whatever? What do you want to happen in the next generations because of your wealth? And how are we going to know we got there? How are you going to measure success? And then what's that mean to you? What's the value to you to get there? And then be able to design what it takes to get there. Generally speaking, after that, and these next two come in, they can be different order, but generally speaking, after that, we have what's called a family alignment milestone. And that's where we bring all the family together. We bring the kids in. And in this meeting, the whole idea is to get the kids' input. And some of my clients don't like this because what I'll tell my clients, who are normally the parents, I don't want to hear from you until we hear from the kids, because if you give an answer, they're all going to go, yep, what he said or what she said. So we want to hear from the kids what they want to see the family stand for, what they want to see going on. One of the questions I've asked is, how do you want to see your inheritance impact your children and your grandchildren? Which is a fascinating thing to ask. And a lot of times the parents are shocked with the answers that they get because they realize they really do have a vision beyond themselves. They're thinking about their kids in the next generation. So, and it's called a family alignment milestone because that's the whole purpose, is get the family kind of aligned. And from that come a lot of different things that they can do. And the family decides if they're going to do more or what they're going to do more. The other piece there, the next one, you see the guide discovery process. That's both the guide discovery interview and then the heritage statement, which is what gets passed to, it's actually written ideally for the great-great-grandchildren who are never going to see you, never going to meet you, about who you are, what you stand for, where you came from, and all those kind of things. Guided discovery is actually an education term. It's the definition is it's a process of learning where you're guided by another to learn from your own experience. What that means is whoever's doing the guided discovery will be asking you a lot of open-ended questions about how did you learn that? Who was important in your life? The turning points in your life, where'd they come from? And what difference did it make in your life? And then the heritage statement is the written version of that can go on. When we first started, it was all written version. Now it's video, written and video and things like that. It's one thing to read somebody's words. It's another thing to hear them saying it. So that's a shift. Then we start into the ongoing things. Remember, the family gets together regularly. The first heritage station, milestone, the initial heritage milestone, that's where the kids actually get the heritage statement and they talk about some of these stories and things. And there's usually a project. Remember I talked about the pre-inheritance experience where the kids take leadership and stuff. Sometimes that project is planning the next year's meeting, because it's amazing. Kids just think that you call a meeting and you walk in and everything's there. The hotel's there, the travel's there, and the transportation stuff is there, the food's there. And so sometimes that project that we give them is they got to plan all that stuff and figure out what it takes to actually put a meeting together. And then you probably can't read those other things. Those are kind of the default themes that go on in the next generations or in the next years. The first one's listening. The second one's empathy. Remember, 60% of the time it was lack of communication and trust. So if you're listening and you're listening empathetically, you're building communication and trust. And then from there, it goes into decision-making and things like that. So now you're getting into the mentoring part. You notice collaborative teams is on there, but it's off to the side. That's because it pops up everywhere. That's your other advisors. That's your financial advisors, whoever it is that you would work with. to get it what it is that you want to have that we talked about in the alignment conversation. So that's what the picture looks like. I didn't want to spend much time in there, but just I want to. So people go, is there really a process? Yeah, there's really a process. It doesn't always happen in that circle. You kind of bounce around. I have one family that actually started with guided discovery and then had a meeting, and then when they went back and brought everybody together. So it doesn't necessarily flow this way, but that's the process. Okay, so next slide. Okay, oh, good. We're just a little bit early because I wanted to make sure there's lots of questions. So I'm about 5 minutes early. That's a good thing. There's more information here. The Sustaining Family Wealth and Unity Across Generations is the white paper I talked about. And it's kind of interesting. That was written by my son and I, which, that means it's multi-generational being written for it. And so those are the 12 elements that we talked about earlier. And you can read through that and see how it fits. There's also with that an assessment that you can do. And I would have everybody in the family do it separately. But it's several questions. And on the left-hand side, you mark how important it is to you. So 5 means it's really important. 1 means I don't care. On the other side, on the right-hand side, you mark how well you think you're doing at it. So 5 means we've got this wired, we're really doing well. And 1 means we haven't even started. And what that thing does is it helps you identify where your gaps are, where the places are that you should start. So and it's amazing. A lot of times it really gets visual because you see, here are the things that we say are like a 4 in terms of important, but we haven't even started. So that's a big gap. We need to start there. And that helps where the family should get started. The third component is what I talked about earlier. That shows how heritage design actually works with financial planning and estate planning to make the complete system. Because without that, you end up with my friend drinking himself to death, or people blowing all their money and all that kind of stuff. It's really how it all fits together so that your family your passing of the wealth can actually do what you said you wanted it to do, and not just go to the next generation. And there's some really bad horror stories about what happens. And when you think about it, most people sometimes have a hard time contemplating this because they think about their kids or grandkids like, oh, they're good. Think about people who've won the lottery. If you've ever read any stories about people who've won the lottery, there's not a lot of success stories there. There's a lot of people that they were good people and they win the lottery and they go crazy and then it's not so good. I had one client that I worked with when he first heard something like this, and we talked about doing pre-inheritance experiences. And he had 2 kids. He had one that was 32 and one was 27. And he said, I think they're okay. I don't think we need to do anything. But we talked about the pre-inheritance experiences. So he decided to do one. So he gave each of his kids a $100,000 gift at Christmas, no strings attached, 100 grand. And he said, the oldest one was the one I thought would take over the business. The youngest one was a little younger. He was 28 or 29. And he said, 90 days later, I kind of had how are things going? In 90 days, the oldest one had blown the whole 100 grand and there wasn't even a new car. They took all their friends on a helicopter ski trip. They did some of their like a cruise to Antarctica or something. I mean, it was gone in 90 days. And he thought, if he takes over the business, they're just going to take all the cash out of the business. It'll never survive. And then the younger son, he's going, I'm good, Well, but what happened was the dad got a call from the local pawn shop. And the guy said, okay, your youngest son was just in here with a really expensive shotgun that I'm sure is yours. And he's pawning it. And I think it's because of drugs. And it was. And that's when they called me back and he said, we got to do something because if $100,000 is going to be blown by the one son and it's going to put the other one into drugs, when I die, it's going to kill him. So how do we prepare him for this? So it's really an important thing that we do that next step. And then the other white paper is the creating multi-generational transformational philanthropy. And we'll talk about that more when we get to that third session in September. And then there we are, mark the calendars. So June 21st and we'll start with the family story and life lessons. That's part of your legacy. And then on September 20th is the philanthropy piece, and both in terms of transformational philanthropy and then as using philanthropy as a training tool for your children and grandchildren. Oh, so there's another poll question. Now, hopefully there are some questions that are in there because I ended up being 2 minutes early from where we wanted to be in terms of being able to ask questions or answer questions. So I'm not sure how we're doing this. Nick, are you tracking those, or is there Q&A somewhere?
Yeah, we're tracking everything.
Okay. So there aren't any questions out there that we should respond to here before?
Well, first, and you just referenced it, we had some questions about the white papers that you mentioned. So they asked about how do they get those white papers, but you're going to go over that, you said, in the third webinar?
Well, that one paper we won't touch till the third one, but they can get the other ones now. I think the last slide has my contact information. Just shoot me an email. And I can send them out to you. And including, I didn't have on there, and Randy has seen this. We wrote a book called Beating the Midas Curse years ago. That's what started all of this. And so if you want any of the white papers or the Beating the Midas Curse book, then send an email and we'll send it to you. We'll need for the book, we'll need your address, but we'll send them to you after that. So that's the best way to get all the stuff. How's that for easy?
Good. And we had multiple people asked, I'm just letting them know, they asked about getting a copy of the presentation and the video. So yes, we are going to send that out to everyone. They'll get the link to the recording and then a copy of the slides. So for all of you asking, you will have access to that. And then our first question for you is, do you recommend including rules like a condition and a trust for heirs, for instance, pursuing an education, job, behavior, et cetera, to ensure wealth is preserved?
That's okay. Now you're going to get the lawyer answer. It depends. But the last part of that is an interesting concept. One is having some restrictions in there are probably good. They don't work as much as people think they do. They're called incentive trusts. It's much better to prepare them than it is to try and protect them. And to give you one example, I had one of the very first things I did in trust work. I had a family that came to me. It was the next generation. There was 2 boys and a girl. And the dad had died and he left an education trust. And the education trust said, I want my kids to go to higher education. So they get money to pay, they get tuition, room and board. And the board, it was indexed to like $1980. There was a certain amount that they got for that. As long as they were going to a accredited college or university, they were taking a full load and they had, I think it was a 3 or better GPA. Sounds really good, except one of the granddaughters was on her 14th year of university, and her plan was to retire in a school. She went from school to school to school. She figured out that once you get to grad school, a full load's only like 6 hours. So, and then once she had like 1 or 2 masters, she could go to a school, she could teach part-time and keep going to school part-time and have the trust pay for all of her, So it's really difficult to make some of those restrictions that are actually going to work because people are creative. So yes, it's good to have some of those restrictions in there, but it's better just to prepare them. If you can prepare them, that's one of the questions I get all the time. How much is enough? Well, that depends on what you want the inheritance to do for your kids. And how much is too much? Well, that depends on how well you've prepared them. If you haven't prepared them, $100,000 could be too much. I hope that helps. And if not, again, that email, if I answer a question that's your question and I didn't nail it, go ahead and shoot me an email and I can respond that way.
Right. The next one is, what do you think is the right age for children to get involved in the family and financial planning?
The financial stuff later, but the family and the philanthropic stuff can come early. I had one family that the kids were 8 and 10, and they gave them each, I think it was $500 to give to a charity. And so the thing was, the kids had to do their research and figure out who they wanted to give the money to. And then they came to the grant committee, which was mom and dad and grandma and grandpa, on the Friday after Thanksgiving and made their pitch. And the dad called me, I think it was 2 years later. And he said, best thing ever. Because my daughter, who is now 10, she was the 8-year-old, she came to the meeting and she goes, I was going to give money to this one organization. But when I looked at their stuff, and it's amazing what they'll do a bit of research on the computer better than we do. When I looked it up, they only spent about 15% of what they got in on the people they're supposed to be serving. They kept about 85%. And the other charities that we gave money to, it wasn't that way. So I didn't think it was good to give that one the money. So you can start with charity really early. We did it with my grandson. My son did it with my grandson, who when he was 7 or he was 8, I think, playing t-ball. And he just said, so what can we do to help somebody else? And there was a guy on his t-ball team who didn't have a mitt. So he had to always, borrow one from somebody else when he went in the field. So they went down to, Walmart or wherever, down to a store, bought the kid a mitt and gave it to him. And that gave an 8-year-old a lesson on how you can help other people practically. The money part of it, how much money and stuff there is, that can be much later. And then you also get into the question, are the in-laws involved in that or not? And all. But in terms of philanthropy and teaching them about money, that can happen really early. Teaching them how much money is in the thing, I recommend come later.
Okay, so off of that question, but with a different angle, someone wants to know, they've been advised to put a coddle on their trust to have next gen's complete treatment if they are substance abusers, specifying what center and a trusted servant to assure their completion and program prior to the inheritance. What do you think?
Yeah, I've seen that too. And because once you get into drug issues, I don't care how good the kid is in terms of being a good person, those are new issues. And so there's a lot of trusts that have that. And there's also like special needs trusts for other things, but there's a lot of trusts that'll say, you can't have a different kind of distribution until we've got certification that you've been through this and you're clean for a certain period of time and that sort of thing. So that is, otherwise you can end up, your money is going to feed the habit and you don't want that. So that's a provision I've seen a lot.
Okay, next question is, how do you get family members to identify their values so you can talk about these?
That's part of that family alignment milestone we talked about, because what we do is we kind of brainstorm about the values as a family. So everybody kind of knows what they are. Then everybody writes down the ones that they want to see. And we put them on the board and we work together and get everybody to identify which ones are most important to the family. Another way we can do it is you'd have everybody do a personal shield, like a family shield, personal shield. What are the 4 things they want to be known for? So there's activities that you can do that are non-threatening, that people can, and you can get the kids and grandkids involved to talk about things that are important to them.
Right. I have one more question. So again, to our audience, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A function. The next question is, your analogy with the quarterback throwing the ball and having the other team intercepted was great. How could this also be an issue with someone in the family who may not be very financially savvy or may be a spendthrift?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting, that's a great question. One of the families I worked with, as I talked to the dad, he said, I want my number one priority is family unity. I want the kids to be unified. His oldest son was an MBA in business and I think CPA and an attorney or something. I mean, he did all that stuff. The middle son was a spendthrift and the youngest son was okay. And I said, so what you're planning on now? And he goes, well, the oldest and the youngest get their money. The other one stays in trust so that he can't blow it all. Okay. And who's the trustee? Well, it's the oldest son. And I went, how do you think that's going to go when your middle son wants money and his older brother is saying no? If you want family unity, and he's like, holy cow, I made it worse. But there are in a lot of trusts those spendthrift provisions and things like that, and there's really creative ways of drafting them. A lot of it though, you need to make sure that it includes the purpose, why I'm doing this. And then they can have provisions that they have to live within a budget for a certain period of time or those kinds of things, or they have to at least get approval for big things they're going to spend money for. But again, what's the purpose? What do you want your inheritance, the impact do you want your inheritance to have on your children and grandchildren? It probably isn't to feed their drug habit or for them to just go blow it all. And so drafting the trust, first by identifying, I want these kind of things. I want them to be able to buy up their first house or something like that. Those kinds of things, that helps drafting the trust when you have a good attorney who's drafting the trust.
All right. Our next question, it looks like they want to know, is there a worksheet available that family members initially can complete to initiate the value dialogue?
Actually, that assessment that's going to be on the elements will help. And there's both. Okay, so remember to send this on the email. There's both the long assessments with the elements white paper, the Sustaining Family Wealth and Unity white paper. That's several pages long, but there's a short version that's only like 10, 12 questions. That's the one I would recommend for kids. And it doesn't really identify values as much as it identifies, what's important to them. Is communication important? Is this important? That important? Values, though, there's several different things. There's a website called 2164 that has a lot of tools that you can use with kids to help them identify values. There's also a book called Beyond Gold that Thayer Willis wrote that has same thing. It's got some activities and exercises you can use. So there are tools out there that you can get online that are really helpful for them, and they're easy. I mean, they're like one of the values edge cards. On the one side, it has different things. Do you care about the environment? Do you care about this? Do you care about that? And then they identify what's important to them, and they pick their top 15, and you develop like a name thing that shows your top 15. But it's non-threatening because everybody's doing it, and they're already pre-printed. They don't have to try and identify it and defend it in any way.
Okay, our next and final question, unless we get any more submitted, is it ever too late to start this process with my family?
No. See, normally you get the lawyer answer with it depends, but no. Because no matter where you start, I had one where I loved it. This guy ran his business. He started his business, ran his business. He's like 80 some years old, and he was still running it. And I said, well, who's going to take over? And he goes, well, I don't think my kids are ready. Well, his kids were in their 60s. And at that point, they didn't want to take over. They were ready to retire. And so we started then with the generation 2 was in their 60s. Generation 3 were in their 30s and 40s. And there were even some of generation 4 when we had that first meeting who were the older. And so it doesn't really matter where you start, because there's going to be generations above and below all the way through. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Rod, for all that valuable information. We really appreciate you taking time to be here with us today.
Okay.
We also want to thank all of our audience for attending and joining us today. Our featured speakers in this planned giving seminar series are experts in a variety of fields, including estate planning, trust law, wealth advising, real estate tax, and charitable giving. They have graciously agreed to share their time and knowledge with the SJSU community, and we are very grateful. The second webinar of the 3-session webinar series will be taking place in June, and we look forward to seeing you there. If you have any additional questions or wish to get in touch with the presenter, please contact Randy Baylog, SJSU's Director of Planned Giving, or visit us on the web at legacy.sjsu.edu. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.